ShadowTalk.
It's time for another Shadow Talk. In this week's episode, Dr. Richard Gold joins us to explain the eFail vulnerability affecting Open PGP and S-MIME. We discuss that despite the increased hype with vulnerability names and logos, there's still a lot that we should be taking seriously. We'll be outlining the factors that you should be considering when trying to prioritize your patching. And do you know your SPIs from your SWIFTs? In part 2, following news of a $15 million theft from Mexican banks, we dig into interbank payment systems and the risks facing banks. All on this week's Shadow Talk. Hello listeners and welcome to the latest edition of Shadow Talk. Joining us today, we've got the habitual Harrison. Hello Harrison.
Hey Mike, how's it going?
Yeah, very well, thank you. And we've also got Dr. Richard Gold with us, which I'm delighted he could join us. Rich, how you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you, Mike.
Let's start by talking about Monday's news, because woke up to lots of noise on Twitter about the earlier than expected release of the eFail branded vulnerability. It seemed to be something, was it 2 proof of concept attacks that displayed some plain text within Open PGP?
Yeah, so this was actually attacks against both Open PGP and S-MIME. S-MIME being significantly more impacted than Open PGP in this case. And the attack goes a little bit like this. If an attacker has access to your email, and this can be encrypted email, so without access to the credentials necessary to unlock it. So this could be either that they have access to email that you've sent already, or this could be that they have access to a mail server where the encrypted email is stored. They can take this, alter it in a particularly interesting way using what they term as malleability gadgets, which we can talk about a little bit more if people are interested. And they can use these gadgets to inject information which is necessary to create a back channel into the email. Now, a back channel in this context is something very simple like a bit of HTML. So they can, for example, include an HTML image tag into an email, which previously did not have an HTML image tag. And due to the buggy client-side implementation of HTML rendering, the client will decrypt the message, add it to a URL, which is part of this HTML, and for example, the HTML image tag, which will cause your HTML rendering in the email client to call off to an attacker-controlled server, and the URL that your email client will try to render, will try to access, will actually be the decrypted plain text of the original email. So it's a rather elaborate attack, lots of different moving parts, but the end result for a cryptographic bug is pretty serious, which is, of course, the complete decryption of email or plain text, and that this can also be used to go to access historically encrypted emails.
Yeah, obviously there was quite a bit of debate across the Twitter sphere. One side of it saying sort of like, yeah, this could be a problem, but there needs to be loads of other circumstances in place. And you mentioned things like gaining access to the mail, first of all. So kind of downplaying it almost. And then the other side was saying, well, yes, but those circumstances could exist. So you should still take this seriously. Where do we stand on either of those two sides?
Well, I think Open PGP was much less impacted than S-MIME, as previously mentioned. And S-MIME is pretty much the corporate standard for encrypted email. So places I've worked in the past where we use S-MIME for all correspondence related to patents, for example. So it certainly has a very, very significant usage and is used for pretty sensitive things. Now, how likely this attack is versus, for example, spear phishing your way onto an endpoint and ripping off somebody's email that way, or pulling the keys off of a box that you've gained access to, or these kind of things. Yeah, in terms of where it stands in the complexity of attack, it's a high complexity attack. As I said, a lot of moving parts, a lot of dependencies, but it highlights, I think, the dangers of rendering rich content in an email client used for secure communications. And it shows that even historically, even if you did good practice in the past, that may not be considered good practice for the future.
Yeah, so for people concerned about S-MIME, are there any recommended actions yet, or is that still ongoing?
The S-MIME one is a little bit more complicated, as the Open PGP, they were able to do a fix in the clients. So the buggy clients could patch and users can install the patches and all will be well. For S-MIME, it's a bit more complicated due to the way that it's baked into the actual S-MIME standard. So they're waiting for the S-MIME standard itself to be updated. Okay. I would say also that, as a general rule, disabling HTML rendering in your email client, if you're using it for secure communications, is a good place to start.
Hey, top tip.
Yes.
Thanks, Rich. Top tip. Okay, of course, this isn't the only flaw in encryption services that we've seen. Was it a couple of weeks back where the Signal one came out as well?
Right. So there's two successive vulnerabilities for Signal Desktop. Now, we should just underline that 100 times. This does not apply to the secure messaging application, which is available on iOS and Android devices, but the desktop client implementation, which people use for convenience. It was a cross-site scripting vulnerability, so a way for content to be introduced, or unauthorized content to be introduced into your Signal Desktop client by a straight up sort of code injection attack, which is typical for cross-site scripting. It was kind of interesting because Signal obviously has a well-deserved reputation, something that I use myself, as being secure. But of course, when you take it from a very lockdown platform such as iOS and you move it to a desktop platform where it has much less restrictions on what can be installed and is much less locked down, then understandably the risk increases. The content security policy for Signal Desktop, as it is effectively a big web application, so it's an Electron web application, was not restricting the behavior of iframes correctly. So them and the attackers could introduce code this way to bypass how the other protections are used inside of the desktop client. There's a quite delicious piece of irony in the advisory itself, where they recommend using PGP instead of Signal Desktop. So, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, really.
I feel that there was another encrypted service vulnerability, flaw, story, and I forget.
So the other thing that was doing the rounds recently was a plugin for Slack to enable end-to-end encryption. And so this is kind of an interesting one as well. People picked this up, as you say, doing the round on the Twitters. But I would say, well, it's kind of a different take on things. Slack is typically used for companies, for corporate communications. Of course, lots of hobbyists use it as well. But the standard Slack setup is such that the administrators can read the messages that are being sent by the users. And again, for a company, for compliance reasons or whatever, it's not unreasonable. But this plugin then allows a user to encrypt end-to-end their messages inside of Slack. So if the administrator tries to read the Slack messages, all they will see is base64 encoded binary when the binary is encrypted. But the user and the recipient the sender and the recipient will then be able to read the plain text. It's if you go to the GitHub page for the tool itself, they say very clearly, this is an untested proof of concept. It's not meant for anything serious. And my feeling is that this is a nice proof of concept. The guys did a good job. It's quite a cute little app. But if you're operating in an environment where you really feel that there is a reason to doubt let's say, the good intentions of the administrators of your Slack room, then I would not use it for anything that would be remotely considered sensitive or could be used against me. Then there are things like Signal, Wire, all these other tools which can be used for off-network communications.
Yeah, so don't send passwords out over Slack, no matter what, really.
If, for example, or if you're needing to discuss a work situation where you're concerned about the behavior of one of the administrators, then don't use something that the administrators control. Pro tip.
Yeah. Can we go back to the name of eFail?
Sure.
Because we've had a lot of this naming nonsense in the last year. Well, probably more than a year, actually. Going back to kind of your Heartbleeds and the stuff that came out with the shadow brokers. Is this getting a bit ridiculous? I mean, it's something every week with a new name. Are we getting death by 1,000 names?
Well, you already have a name, which is the CVE number, but people are generally quite poor at remembering CVE 2018-10994. But Heartbleed or eFail are quite handy mnemonics. So personally, I'm quite ambivalent about it. I think the issue comes when the fact that it's a named vulnerability leads people to believe it's more serious than it is. And for me, the big contender for this was Bad Luck. They had, a nice name. They had a web page and everything, and there was a lot of hype. This is going to be, eternal blue, eternal romance for SMB on Linux, and turned out to really be applicable in very, very limited circumstances. So I think when the named vulnerabilities become a way or an excuse for people to hype things up more than they are deserved, then yeah, I think it's an issue. But just naming your vulnerabilities so they're easier to remember, because as I say, long, unwieldy CVE numbers are kind of tricky to keep in your head.
Yeah, point taken. I think, there's definitely two sides to this. I guess the final question on all of this is, when you've got all of these branded vulnerabilities and you've got the ones that aren't branded as well, how do you make decisions with loads of this hype about what you prioritize first?
Right. Generally speaking, when in my team, where we're looking at these kind of things, we look to see, is the software widely deployed? So is it used by a lot of different people, little different places? So things like Microsoft Windows, Microsoft Office, these kind of things are obviously top of that list. Is it being exploited in the wild? And is there a publicly available exploit for it? And these two things are very, very different. So we often see an APT campaign, they'll either create, dev their own, or buy an exploit for a particular campaign. They'll use it for a particular purpose and go about the business. Then these kind of things become public, and often people get very worked up about it. But usually that exploit code was only available to a very, very small group of people. So the risk to the general public at large was typically quite low. However, as soon as the exploit becomes public, especially if there's proof of concept code or it becomes relatively straightforward for it to be used by other people, then all bets are off and it becomes a real significant concern. So those are the things that we look for.
Hello, welcome to part 2 of Shadow Talk, and we want to talk now about the 300 million pesos or $15 million theft from 5 Mexican banks using the interbank system. It was reported as a cyber incident, so that's all nice and clear then, is it, Harrison?
It's super clear.
Yeah.
So I mean, this was initially kind of announced, and we actually talked about it on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. But, when it was first announced, there wasn't really many details that had been released, and it kind of just, it's just one of those things that kind of happened, and then we just kind of had to keep moving on. But details were released this week about at least some details were released about what happened. So it appears that some threat actors had infiltrated the interbank system SPEI, which is used by a number of different Mexican banks. And so basically, it's still kind of unknown whether or not there was an insider kind of associated with this, but it seems like there were transfers that were made to kind of dummy accounts, and then they were siphoned out of the ATMs within, specific like physical bank branches. I think it was the CEO of LGEC who actually manages some of the software. He came out and said, well, this isn't really a problem with our software specifically, because our software doesn't communicate with the internet, and it doesn't communicate with the cloud. And so he was saying that it kind of resided locally within the banking infrastructure. So if it was a problem with that software, then that meant that the attackers had to actually be on the banking infrastructure. So it's really hard to tell exactly what's going on, but the result was, as you said, a very large withdrawal of funds.
Yeah, so I always struggle with this to really understand what's going on. This and like all of the SWIFT reports that occur. There seems to be two sides, whether it's to do with flaws in the infrastructure used to send the payments itself, or whether it's the systems that are used to send and receive the payments that actually have the flaws in them. So I'm just never quite sure which one it is when we have all of these reports.
Yeah, I mean, again, like you mentioned the Swift stuff, like Swift, has never, at least it's never been claimed to have been hacked itself. But obviously there's been a lot of threat actors in the past who have taken advantage of the Swift, messaging system. And that's how they've been able to kind of steal all that money. It looks like this is kind of a similar instance, but not using Swift, using a different kind of a system, which is that SPEI system that I mentioned.
So in my experience with network intrusions and looking at how these kind of APT crews operate, they look at how to achieve their goals with the minimum amount of risk and effectively in the most straightforward way. They take the path of least resistance. And for me, hacking Swift or the SPEI system is a much harder way to achieve their goals than looking for a weak part in the infrastructure that connects to these systems. Now, when we've looked at something like the Bangladesh attack and how that was pulled off, what it seemed like certainly when it came to the Swift side of things, that there was a piece of software that was used to communicate with the Swift network, and the attackers found a way to manipulate that so the logging was altered, so they could make transactions that couldn't be logged. Now, also making these kind of transactions certainly for Swift, in many places requires either what's called 4 eyes or 6 eyes authentication or verification. So 2 or 3 people need to be involved to be able to make manual payments using these systems. Automated ones are handled differently, but manual ones, so these kind of one-off ad hoc payments, which you're seeing, the ones which are reported about in these news articles, these are the ones where they need quite, the bar is quite high to be able to make these kind of payments. Now, in order to get around that, attackers have been known to compromise multiple workstations, monitor the employees performing tasks to understand how they operate, how they use the tools in the banks and other financial institutions. So it is certainly possible to compromise enough places and gain a good enough network position so that you can make and then approve fraudulent payments. But still, it's still quite a bit of work. But even that is probably less work than getting into the core infrastructure and intercepting payments as they, for example, travel across the wire on their way to somewhere.
Yeah, Rich, I would totally agree with you. I think it's interesting that you bring up the whole idea of like automated payments and then also having kind of those manual eyes on. There was a magazine article from like the end of last year that I was looking into when I was writing this. And it basically was talking about there were going to be more widespread usage across a lot of different banks and across a lot of different banking products. Using an automated SPEI pool system. And it was actually supposed to kind of go into effect around when this happened. So not saying that that's what happened here, but it does seem like there was a lot of changes going on internally with that system. And maybe some of those automatic payments were getting implemented or something like that was going on. And somebody saw that could be taken advantage of. But I just thought that was an interesting point there that you made.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment. Certainly, when I've looked at these kind of systems, the vast majority of payments have been automatic. And so it's harder then for a threat actor to get involved and manipulate one of these things compared to just making a one-off payment. But as I mentioned, most financial institutions do have plenty of controls in place to prevent these kind of things. So the attackers do have to do a bit of work to achieve their goals. I would say when you're thinking about advice, it's difficult to give advice about such a very wide-ranging topic such as this. However, I would say that the overriding goal is to increase attacker costs. So anything that you're putting in place which can put a speed bump in the way of an attacker is a very effective thing to do. The NSA has this wonderful paper on adversary obstruction. So it was all about not that you prevent an adversary from achieving their goal, because that's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but you obstruct them. You make their life difficult. You make it awkward for them. You make it very difficult for them. You want to make these people really, really cry when they're trying to get through your network. And the more speed bumps you put in place, these also become opportunities for instrumenting your network to look for suspicious activity, and that provides you with more opportunity to spot them. So the more speed bumps you have, the more places you can find them, that increases your chances to detect them and kick them out of the network.
Okay, speed bump security. On that note, I think we'll call it to a close. Thank you so much for joining us, Richard.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us, Harrison.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great week. Thank you for listening to this week's edition of Shadow Talk. For more research and analysis from the Digital Shadows team, visit resources.digitalshadows.com.